Hey, everybody. It is Friday, May 17th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to.
So, Moshe, I saw that two of the most popular news people on Instagram had breakfast today.
Who's that? Well, just in the news and information community, we're big fans of our friend Sharon McMahon of Sharon Says So. You might know her on Instagram. You might know her podcast. And so she happened to be in New York. So we got breakfast, talked shop, talked news, talked about our mutual experiences navigating the news on social media and some of the more interesting reactions we get from people. So it was great to see her in person. She typically lives in far northern, a rural part of Minnesota. So it was great to have her in the urban jungle here in New York. So Sharon, if you're listening, hello and thank you. And thanks for making sure that people have the facts. She made a point on her feed of being like, Moshe, people keep asking about our height difference. Sharon happens to be 6 feet tall. And she's
really?
like, yeah. And she's like, how tall are you? And I'm like 5'9". She's like, So she called me out on her Instagram account for 1 million people being like, Moshe, you're not 5'9". I'm like, fine, Sharon. You have quite an eye. I'm 5'8.5", but we round up. And she's like, by the way, everyone, you should note, if a man is under 6 feet tall, he typically rounds up on his height. And she's right. It's a thing for us under 6 foot men.
It's funny, Moshe, because I used to say that I'm 5'2". And I kind of am. I am 5'2", but I'm really like 5'1 3/4".
Oh, so you're rounding up a little bit too.
I'm rounding up, but in my later years, I'm almost leaning into the shortness, and I'll be like, I'm 5 foot nothing. I kind of like play into it. I don't know why. I think I've become more self-deprecating as I get older.
5 foot nothing. Jill Wagner, everybody, bringing you the news. On her tippy toes. All
right, speaking of the news, let's get to it. The Dow hits 40,000 for the first time. But what exactly does that mean? We're going to look at the difference between Wall Street and Main Street. To the Middle East, that massive U.S. dock meant to deliver aid to Gaza, almost ready to go. Plus, some tension in Israel over a day after plan for Gaza. To the U.S. elections, intelligence chiefs say they're seeing increasing number of threats. President Biden asserting executive privilege over recordings from the classified documents probe. Google and Harvard are out with the most detailed map ever of the human brain. And let's do lunch, but on the weekend. How the pandemic has upended when and how we eat at restaurants. And the backlash continues over NFL player Harrison Butker's commencement speech, plus what we are watching, reading, and eating.
And for what we're watching, Jill, I'll have a commencement speech that everyone can agree on and should watch this weekend.
And I'll give you a little tease for what we're eating. One of my friends just went to the Sweets and Snacks Expo in Indianapolis and got a taste of all the upcoming snacks and candy.
Snack Trends 2024.
Correct. And she gave me a full rundown. The one thing I'll hint at, reversible gumballs.
Jill, I'm all ears.
All right, let's start with the economy, or at the very least, a big day for the stock market. The Dow hit 40,000 for the first time ever on Thursday. Investors are growing confident that the Federal Reserve will start cutting interest rates later this year. As we reported yesterday, some new data showed that perhaps, finally, inflation is ticking lower, which would mean that the Fed could stick with its plan of cutting rates sooner rather than later. Of course, it is still too soon to tell. Dow 40,000 is a huge milestone, but it is mostly symbolic. So what does it really mean? Most sometimes we talk about Wall Street versus Main Street, and there really is a difference. I mean, so if you have a 401k, this is great news, right? But the milestone doesn't mean much more in terms of anything else related to the economy. The Dow itself is an index. It tracks the stock market activity of 30 large U.S. companies like Apple, Amazon, the Walt Disney Company, McDonald's. A lot of economists and investors actually would argue that the Dow isn't even the best barometer of the overall stock market.
S&P 500.
Yeah, I mean, when I was the Money Watch reporter for CBS News, I was based at the stock exchange. My husband, who works in finance, would always tell me, pay more attention to the S&P 500. Like, why are you focusing so much on the Dow? And that's what all of the traders talked about actually on the
Yeah.
floor. The S&P 500, as its name implies, is a measure of 500 stocks instead of just 30, and it gives a bigger picture of just the overall market. But still, there is something to be said about this milestone. Art Hogan, he's a chief market strategist, he tells CNN, mentioned the Dow. And to most people, that means the stock market. He says it's this instant way of telling the world which way the market is moving, even if the average isn't an accurate measure of the tens of thousands of stocks listed on the nation's exchanges. And Moshe, I could tell you, when I was on the floor of the stock exchange going on about only like 7 to 10 years ago now, the Dow was around 20,000. So clearly the market's going in the right direction.
Yeah, actually, right before COVID, in February, March of 2020, there it peaked to 28,000, collapsed to under 20,000, down to 19,000. So it's more than doubled since the COVID valley of 4 years ago. And to your point, the difference between the Dow and the S&P, significant here when you look at the numbers. So the Dow companies, you talked about those 30 companies, there's about $32 billion benchmark to the Dow. The S&P 500, $11 trillion in investments are connected to the S&P 500. And you mentioned earlier, like 401k plans, many of them are S&P index funds, right? They're connected to the S&P 500. Now, we should note, though, that the S&P also reached a milestone at 5,300, is a much lower threshold. But ultimately here, the S&P 500 matters much more, even though the Dow gets all the love from the media, etc. But we do get a sense across the economy on all these companies that are growing, right? In the Dow, you have Goldman Sachs, you have United Health Group, you have Caterpillar. All of them have been big contributors here to this latest milestone. Amex is up huge. And part of what we're seeing now is that the market and investors are getting more confident that the Fed will actually achieve what we thought was the impossible, that soft landing, where they brought inflation down. Most recently, we told you about the numbers this week, that inflation went down slightly more than expected, which gives them hope that interest rates will finally start to go down in the fall. So that's what they believe led to this latest achievement here by the Dow, the excitement in the market, that for all of the warnings about recession, that somehow we will be able to avoid it. That's the feeling right now. Now, that's Wall Street. And we should mention that the top 10% of America controls. And we should mention that the top 10% of Americans income-wise basically own about 93% of the stocks. So even if you have stocks in a 401k plan, et cetera, the vast majority of the shares owned by just a certain percentage of Americans, which is what gets you to Main Street, right? The feeling is no matter the excitement here, the numbers you're seeing in the stock market, ultimately, to many Americans, they don't matter that much. Food, gas, rent, housing, we told you about it in yesterday's podcast, all up dramatically. When you look over, and forgive us for the background noise, it's bedtime here at our household. Sweet Olivia's going to bed, or she's just really upset about inflation lately. I need to ask her at some point. But ultimately here, in all seriousness, the experience most Americans are having is that all these other prices have gone up. So regardless of the headlines about low unemployment or a record high stock market, it's how people feel in their own wallets, in their own purses, as they pay their bills every month. So it is really, as we talk about in today's newsletter, the Mo newsletter, over at mo.news/newsletter, a tale of two economies.
All right, now to the Middle East. More food and medicine could be on the way for Palestinians in Gaza. Remember that floating dock or temporary pier that the U.S. said that it was building to help bring aid to the area? It is done. The U.S. has successfully towed a floating dock system to the shore of the Gaza Strip. CENTCOM writing on Twitter, as part of this effort, no U.S. troops entered Gaza. And they say the trucks that are carrying humanitarian assistance are expected to start moving ashore in the coming days. In terms of cost, it's about $320 million. The way that this is expected to work is that the UN will get the aid and then coordinate its distribution. Now, over the next 2 days, the goal from the U.S. military and aid groups is to load 3 to 5 trucks from the pier and send them into Gaza, kind of like a test of the process. The Pentagon says that it will probably take another 24 hours to make sure everything is set up. But once it is operational, it could be a game changer in terms of aid. Defense officials telling the New York Times that the first 48 hours of its operation should deliver more aid than all of the airdrops to date combined. The Pentagon has said that the pier could deliver as many as 2 million meals a day.
And we should note the population in Gaza, about 2.3 million people there. Also, as we talk about the region, over on the Israeli side, some tension right now between the defense minister and the prime minister. This is Prime Minister Netanyahu and the defense minister Yoav Gallant about what to do the day after. Yes, they're still having this conversation now more than 7 months into the war in Israel. There's no love lost there between Netanyahu and Gallant. Said he would oppose any long-term military rule by Israel. Another member of the war cabinet, the other member, Benny Gantz, who also is a Netanyahu opponent, but they all came together after October 7th to try to work together in a coalition, agreeing with the defense minister that he spoke the truth, that he also opposes long-term military rule and occupation over Gaza. Remember, between 2005 and October 7th, Israel was out of Gaza. They had a blockade on the border, but ultimately it was ruled independently, initially by the Palestinian Authority, and then Hamas took over just over a year later. So for the Israelis now, as they finish the military operation there, the conclusion here is Rafah plus some potential cleanup here with some extra Hamas that they see keep popping up in various parts of Gaza, is who's going to run the place. They have no interest. The vast majority of Israelis have no interest in civilian rule over 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And the way it's been laid out is you have two alternatives: the return of Hamas or Israeli. And the way it's been laid out is here are your alternatives. Number one, Hamas remains in charge, non-starter. Number two, Israel occupies it, military rule and civilian rule, non-starter for many Israelis. Number three, an alternative Palestinian rule. Now, it's been pitched to Arab countries to come in as a coalition. They have no interest. Ultimately, they say the Palestinians should be ruled by Palestinians. So who is that? Well, Gallant and others are looking at a reformed Palestinian Authority. They're the government that runs the West Bank part of Palestinian territory, oversees several million Palestinians there. They are the ones pushed out by the coup in Hamas, by the Hamas coup more than 15 years ago in the Gaza Strip. So the Americans, a lot of Western countries, certain Israelis, including Gallant, say maybe a reformed Palestinian Authority. Let's restore them. With, again, some reforms because they are run by Mahmoud Abbas, who's 88 years old and, seen as very corrupt, and 90% of Palestinians want him out. But ultimately, they recognize that Israel should exist and are open to negotiations over a long-term plan and not a military-first strategy like Hamas. Now, for Netanyahu, non-starter. He doesn't agree that the Palestinian Authority can be reformed and doesn't want them in charge of Gaza. To which Gallant and others in Israel say, then what? What are your options? Again, we're back now to Hamas or Israeli rule. Again, both not wanted by the majority of the world and, frankly, the majority of Israelis. But Bibi sees the PA as a hostile entity here and thinks that they can come up with a new alternative government, but you're basically needing to come up with something from scratch there. And given where things are at, given the urgency here, remember the Americans were saying a couple of weeks into the war in October, like, hey, do you have a plan for the day after? Because just speaking from an American perspective, ultimately here, it didn't go so great for us in Iraq when we didn't really have a game plan. So Israel, please learn our lesson. Well, the Israeli government, at least portions of it, 7 months in, still do not have a game plan for the civilian rule of 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
Moshe, it is something that you and reporter Barak Ravid talked about on the Interview podcast even a few weeks ago. And it appears still, as you're mentioning, no answers from Netanyahu, who partly doesn't want to risk upsetting his right-wing government. And it also comes as fighting in Gaza is really picking back up.
Yeah, remember, it's a coalition government in Israel. So he's got people to his left who are like, what's the game plan, including his defense minister and the other war cabinet member. And then he's got folks to his right who don't mind reoccupying, regardless of how the majority of the world feels about it, how the majority of Palestinians feel about it, and how the majority of Israelis feel about it. But as you mentioned, fighting picking back up. We're watching the situation unfolding in the southern city of Rafah right now. Israeli ground forces have also returned to some areas in northern Gaza where new elements of Hamas have popped up in certain areas. Remember, you still have several hundred miles of tunnels under Gaza. A number of them have been destroyed but not all of them. And so that's where things stand right now. And to the points we've been making throughout the war, Hamas will continue in some form. Now, the Israelis say they've eliminated their ability to do anything remotely like October 7th and launch major attacks, but ultimately they still exist. The number one and the number two have remained hidden underground in those tunnels and are still giving marching orders to what's left of the group, believed to be about 15 to 20% of the terror group.
Time now for the speed read from Axios. U.S. intelligence chiefs are warning that an increasing number of foreign actors are trying to influence the U.S. election. The director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, telling the Senate Intelligence Committee, the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, telling the Senate Intelligence Committee that Russia, China, and Iran remain the country's most significant foreign election threats. Although the U.S. has seen an increasing number of threats from other actors, officials say one of the most concerning threats to this year's election are those against election workers themselves, which often stem from false narratives about the 2020 election. But the federal government's ability to protect elections, they say, has increased in recent years. They say they've never been more prepared. To their point, though, election workers have been resigning over threats that they received, things like harassment and threats of violence against election officials of both parties and their families.
Yeah, so keep in mind here that there's a number of goals this fulfills for the Chinese, for the Russians, for the Iranians. Well, number one, those are all authoritarian countries. So making democracy look chaotic, making us look like we're fighting ourselves, which, by the way, we make it a bit easy for them to do this, exacerbating tensions that already exist, only reinforced to folks in their countries being like, look, if any of you want, more freedoms and press freedom and want to be anything like America, like look at the mess over there. So they have an incentive to create chaos here, to sow what are already tensions, already divisions in this country, and make them worse beyond, actually impacting the result. When we talk about election interference, it's interference with the entire democratic process, right? And making Americans feel like their own system is messed up by creating fake groups that you think are super liberal or super conservative, saying things. And you're like, oh my God, I've heard of this group. And they're just a figment created by various Russian or Chinese cyber hackers here. So again, we make it easy because of the divisions we already have in our society for them to, use their sophisticated influencing apparatus and cyber hacking and messing on social media to make things feel even worse. We've mentioned this on the pod before, Jill, but back in 2016, they created like fake BLM groups. They were recruiting people to rallies. It turns out some of the rallies that happened in 2016 were actually rallies organized by, a bunch of Russians on their computers working for the Russian government, saying incendiary things to make Americans feel increased divisions. So again, this is sort of their candy land, like their candy store, being able to like, oh, how can we mess with America today? Take advantage of our open systems, take advantage of our openness. This again speaks to the argument you've heard from the federal government in regards to TikTok. Like we make ourselves vulnerable to foreign actors who take advantage of the open systems that we have here. So just something to keep in mind, and something we remind you on this podcast and on the Instagram feed often. If you see something that really upsets you, or you're extremely supportive of, and you haven't seen it anywhere else, or you see it on social media, before you share it, check it out, because there is a chance that it might not be real, and it might not even be coming from this country.
So Scott Galloway, a friend of the pod, who doesn't know he's a friend of the pod, a Pivot
Scott Galloway,
co-host.
Are you listening to the podcast? We need
Come
to have you
on,
on.
Scott.
Come on.
Hello.
We got to reach out to him. Yes.
He likes to point out that if you were Russia or China, why wouldn't you do this?
Yeah.
That this is the easiest way and the most inexpensive way for them to take on America. Militarily, they're not going to win a war with us. It's a lot easier to create discontent, tension, problems for this country through TikTok, through Twitter, and as you're mentioning, through this kind of open society that we have, a free press, etc.
Yeah, and you've seen those efforts. Listen, there's a lot written about Russia attempting to, manipulate the Trump campaign in 2016. There was the Mueller report. We don't need to go into detail there, but certainly they see also there. Donald Trump in particular is very anti-NATO, very into, let's let Putin, figure out what he needs to do in Ukraine. So they certainly have, there are there are reasons why they might support a certain candidate in this election, but the thing that's easiest for them to do is just sow discontent and get us to fight with each other.
Moshe, speaking of real news and things that are actually happening in terms of the election that we are not making up, we do have some news, a little bit more news about the debates and a vice presidential debate.
Yes. So we told you yesterday that 2 presidential debates have been scheduled now between the candidates. There's a June 27th debate on CNN, a September 10th debate on ABC. A VP debate has now been offered by CBS News. The Biden campaign has said yes, which would have obviously involved Vice President Kamala Harris. A couple dates have been thrown out in late July, early August. It would fall right between the 2 conventions. Right now, mid-July, you have the Republican convention in Milwaukee. That's where Trump's VP choice will officially be nominated. And then you have the Democratic convention in Chicago in mid-August. So they're waiting on an official VP nominee to have that debate. Again, Biden has said yes. We're waiting on word from the Trump campaign on whether they'll accept this 3rd debate. Again, this debate would be between the 2 vice presidential candidates. And one additional note, when it comes to Trump's VP choice, we'll go through soon again who the choices are. He continues to deliberate and throw names out there. He did do an interview in the last 24 hours that said there's a pretty good chance he will announce his VP at the convention in Milwaukee on July 15th, that he's not going to announce it anytime before.
If there's one thing he knows, it's TV,
moments, yes.
ratings, moments. He gets it. From Politico, President Biden invoked executive privilege Thursday to block House Republicans from obtaining audio recordings of his interview with special counsel Robert Hur. This is related to his handling of classified documents. Biden is arguing that the committees are only looking to manipulate them for political gain. In a letter to Republican House leaders, the White House counsel wrote that, quote, the absence of a legitimate need for the audio recordings lays bare your likely goal to chop them up, distort them, and use them for partisan political purposes. A reminder here that the special counsel, who happened to be a Trump-appointed Republican, found that while President Biden did mishandle classified documents, no criminal charges were warranted. Hur had released a full written transcript of the 2 days of interviews that Biden did back in October. This new executive privilege from Biden comes just hours before the House Judiciary Committee moved forward with its effort to hold Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for defying their requests for the tapes. The privilege claim means that the contempt referral would not be enforced.
Remember, we told you back when this all went down about the report that at times Hur's report sort of characterizes Biden as a bumbling old man who sometimes is confused. Now, when you actually look at the transcript, he appears to be pretty coherent. But Republicans want to dig deeper. They want to hear the audio tapes. Obviously, now they say it's their legitimate oversight duty to ensure the president is coherent. Clearly, they also have a political agenda as well, given this is an election year, and Trump would very much want to be able to use, clips of Biden audio sounding like he doesn't know what he's talking about in various campaign ads. Hence, the White House saying here, we're not releasing the audio. Now, what's very interesting, Jill, sort of the ironic thing is the White House says that Hur mischaracterized the conversation. The president was totally coherent, totally knew what he was saying. Look at the transcript, but we don't want to release the audio. We're not releasing the audio because we know that Biden has a stutter, sometimes is halting in his speech, sometimes kind of meanders off into, incoherence, sometimes his sentences meander and they don't quite, make certain sense, and he fades out and fades in. Anyway, I imagine that's on the tapes. They also note that these 2 days of interviews took place right in the days after the October 7th attacks in Israel, and the president was working 24/7 at that time. So again, they clearly have made a decision here not to release the tapes. Republicans not happy. Speaker Mike Johnson says the following. President Biden is apparently afraid for the citizens of this country and everyone to hear those tapes. They obviously confirm what special counsel is about and would likely cause, I suppose, in his estimation, such alarm with the American people that the president is using all of his power to suppress their release. So there you have it, Jill. I would imagine unlikely these tapes see the light of day anytime between now and November.
I do appreciate the dramatic voice that you used to read that statement.
I was trying to do my best Mike Johnson, Jill.
From CNN, scientists just published the most detailed map of a cubic millimeter of the human brain. Smaller than a grain of rice, the mapped section of the brain includes over 57,000 cells, 230 millimeters of blood vessels, and 150 million synapses. The project is a collaboration between Harvard and Google, and it's looking to accelerate connectomics. That's the study of how neurons are wired together over a much larger scale. So our brains are kind of like a jungle. Neuron branches crisscross regions, forming networks that process perception, memories, and even consciousness. Blood vessels tightly wrap around these branches to provide nutrients and energy. Other brain cell types form intricate connections with neurons and support the brain's immune function and fine-tune neural network connections. So mapping components of the brain and their connections can really improve our understanding of how the brain works and when and why it goes wrong.
Jill, some of these areas of the brain, literally 1/1000th of a human hair in terms of thickness. The brain, extremely complex, and they're very interested in learning more about it. Why? A brain map that charts this jungle you described can help us tackle a whole number of things, according to these scientists. Neurological disorders, Alzheimer's, the origins of our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviors. And so, aided by machine learning tools from Google Research, the Harvard team traced neurons, blood vessels, brain cells at a nanoscale. Again, when we're talking about nano, we're talking about 1/1000th of the thickness of a hair. The images reveal previously unknown quirks in the human brain, including mysterious tangles in neuron wiring, neurons that connect through multiple contacts to other cells. The brain, extremely complex, and we're just at the beginning of really starting to get an understanding of it. Now, this data set that they have so far is massive. They say it's 1.4 petabytes. What's a petabyte? That's 1 million gigabytes. So a lot of information here available. They're making it available to folks. They're making it available to other researchers to dig in here. And remarkable, Jill, again, what you're talking about, the map here, a grain of rice, 1 cubic millimeter. And think about how big our heads are. We have some of the largest brains when it comes to mammals, right? And it's extremely complex. And so this is pretty exciting news.
This story from Axios: our restaurant spending is shifting from weekday lunch hours to the weekends. That is according to some new data from Square. It is a reflection of pandemic behavior changes and an important insight for restaurants as they continue to adapt in order to survive and thrive. So weekday lunches share of overall restaurant transactions fell nationally from about 21% in 2019 to 18% in 2023. That's based on data from food and drink establishments that use Square. By contrast, the weekends share grew from about 30% in 2019 to 35% in 2023, and happy hour transactions were about flat, 7% in 2019 and 8% in 2023. So I guess everyone's still drinking after work, whether they're working at home or in the office.
It's pretty remarkable that the chart here, I can include the link in the show notes, but you see that like weekday lunch in Atlanta is down 8%, but weekend is up 8.4%. Boston weekday lunch down 10.1%. On weekends up 10.3%. So again, it really shows you this like direct shift you're seeing. So while there's a perception here that consumers are cutting back at restaurants, spending has actually increased. The bigger change is consumer behavior when we're going out. So, a lot of this speaks to hybrid. A lot of this speaks to work from home. So people are eating their lunch at home with remote work, and the restaurant spend has shifted to the weekends. So the bottom line here is, Jill, make your weekend reservations, brunch reservations, because the lines are long if you haven't noticed already.
And because I am forever a contrarian, I like weekday lunches now.
Well, you're going to probably have an easier time finding a table based on these figures.
And finally, from CNN, the NFL is distancing itself from controversial comments by Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker during a recent commencement address at Benedictine College. That is a small Catholic school in Kansas. As part of his comments, he called Pride Month a deadly sin. He railed against abortion, IVF, surrogacy. He bemoaned diversity and equity initiatives. And he also set off waves of criticism when he suggested that women find more fulfillment through getting married and having children than by pursuing careers. That's after directly quoting a song by Taylor Swift,
who we should note is the girlfriend of his teammate.
So take a listen.
For the ladies present today, congratulations on an amazing accomplishment. You should be proud of all that you have achieved to this point in your young lives. I want to speak directly to you briefly because I think it is you, the women, who have had the most diabolical lies told to you. How many of you are sitting here now, about to cross this stage, and are thinking about all the promotions and titles you are going to get in your career? Some of you may go on to lead successful careers in the world, but I would venture to guess that the majority of you are most excited about your marriage and the children you will bring into this world.
Jill, these comments have fired up social media.
Right. So much so that the NFL issued a statement saying that Butker's comments do not reflect the views of the league. They say Harrison Butker gave a speech in his personal capacity. His views are not those of the NFL as an organization. The NFL is steadfast in our commitment to inclusion, which only makes our league stronger. GLAAD also issued a statement calling Butker's speech a clear miss and woefully out of step with Americans about pride, LGBTQ people, and women.
The Chiefs, who are the defending Super Bowl champs, have not responded to requests for comment so far. However, whether it's social media or traditional television, plenty of women have made their feelings very clear when it comes to Butker's speech here, which again was Benedictine University, a kicker who the vast majority of Americans have never heard about. Keep in mind, there's about 1,700 NFL players, and the kickers on the teams are the ones who are literally sometimes spending the least amount of time on the field.
To the point, Moshe, when we were talking about it before the podcast, and my personal opinion on this is obviously I don't agree with him. Yeah. I also don't care what he says. and I Jill, said this to you.
Jill,
and
you've been a Harrison Butker fan for many years. So you're very disappointed. Yes.
Well, because I said to you, I'm like, number one, I don't know who he is. Yeah. And number two, he's just a football player. And you were like, no, Jill, he's a kicker. And I'm like, I don't even know what that means, but okay. He's below a football player.
It just means he spends the least amount of time on the field. And, for the most part, no insult to kickers, but just saying you're typically thinking about, running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, star defensive players. Anyway, moving on here. There's a columnist for the Kansas City Star named Sam McDowell who writes, "This wasn't a case of foot and mouth. It was a well-prepared speech. Women listening in the audience, rather than being rewarded with a diploma on graduation day, were made to listen as he promoted the role of homemaker, not as an acceptable choice, but as their duty as a husband's servant." So that was his interpretation of the full Butker speech. Now, some have pointed out that Butker's mom happens to be a physicist at Emory.
One of my favorite facts about this story.
that his mother is a career woman, but he focused not on his mother, but his wife in the speech, who he said, never had a career, but has no disappointment because, her greatest achievement was being a homemaker. And again, this is ultimately a choice for women out there. But I think the issue is that, many people felt like, why am I listening to Harrison Butker talk about his wife's choice? And I'm receiving my diploma today. And he's talking about how, regardless of your career, it's about, ultimately being a homemaker. So an opinion that some felt was a very, unique, bizarre choice. And in some cases, insulting choice on graduation day. Now, at the same time, you have conservative voices, including people at the university, who have praised the speech as 100% correct, that it reflects his self-professed deep Catholic faith. And that's something to keep in mind here is that, this is a religious school. He's a religious guy. And so he was speaking to a very specific audience there. And so nonetheless, it is commencement season. We began the week talking about Seinfeld's speech. We end the week talking about Harrison Butker's speech. And so here we are.
And actually, we have another commencement speech that you're going to be talking about, which means it is Friday. Cheers to the freaking weekend. Time for what we are watching, reading, and eating. So Moshe, I'll let you kick it off. What are you watching?
So some of you might be familiar with the author Brad Meltzer. He's actually written bestsellers in fiction, in nonfiction, in children's literature, in comic books, a whole variety of things. He gave the commencement speech, Jill, at your alma mater, the University of Michigan. And some people have found his speech actually very inspirational. He talks about the need for empathy in a world in a world that is divided. That, he's talking in the speech that anyone in this crowd has people who didn't make it till graduation day, who they're thinking about, maybe suffering from loss, sickness, other issues in their lives, and it would behoove all of us to show a little bit of kindness, a little bit of empathy at a time like this. And so I thought it was a really nice speech. I posted a clip on our Instagram feed. We'll post the full speech here on the. We'll post the full speech here in the show notes. And so, just as we talk about controversial speeches, I want to make sure that there was a positive, uplifting speech to watch. All right, Jill. Enough with commencement addresses. What are you watching this weekend?
Every time I go on Instagram, I feel like there's a new commencement address on the on the Mo.news account. I'm like, what is happening?
Jill, it's incredible the number of people who watch these clips. For inspiration, but also because, they have issues with certain statements being made. Jill, we got about 6 weeks left of graduations. Just fair warning.
Okay, I'm going to be watching part 1 of Bridgerton season 3. It premiered on Netflix yesterday, actually. And this season focuses on Penelope Featherington and her quest to snag a husband. Will it be her longtime crush, Colin Bridgerton? I guess we'll have to see. But I am very excited about this one. Season 1 of Bridgerton, off the charts, amazing. Season 2, also pretty good. So bring it on, season 3. All right, Moshe, what are you reading?
So this sort of combines what we're reading and what we're eating, Jill. There's a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the challenges of picking the best pizza slice in New York. It turns out the estimates on pizza restaurants in New York range anywhere from 1,600 to more than 3,000, depending on the count. Either way, I will often get this question from people when they travel to New York. They'll message me on Instagram being like, Moshe, what's the best pizza? I'm like, depends on who you ask. How much time do you have? Because, it's a city of 9 million people. So anyway, the Wall Street Journal lists a whole bunch of them, and we have it linked for you in the show notes. Jill, did you have a favorite when you lived in the city?
Moshe, I was a fan of Sophia's Pizza. It's in the 50s on First Avenue, and it's kind of like just a counter. It's not fancy. You just basically go and get pizza, and maybe they have a few other items. But that, I think, was my favorite pizza in New York. What about you?
It's shifted, honestly. When we went from Manhattan to Brooklyn, like in Manhattan, I like John's in the West Village. I know that's a very well-known place. When I moved to Brooklyn, we discovered Lucali's Pizza. So there's Lucali's and there's Baby Luke's. And so Lucali's is my new favorite. And should we move to another part of New York, I imagine I'll have another new favorite because that's the deal in New York. We got a lot of pizza.
And now that you've got the wheels turning, artichoke is amazing too. Artichoke pizza.
I'll say this about artichoke. I think 10 years ago it was amazing. I think it's lost its way, Jill.
Okay, so good to know because I have not had it for at least 10 years.
2014 called. They want their pizza back.
But that's what you get for asking me what's good in the city.
It's like as a Chicagoan who went to college in 2000 and hasn't lived there for 25 years. People are like, right. What do you like in Chicago? I'm like, I haven't been there for 2 decades, so I can't really make recommendations anymore. So I'm asking people where to go when I'm in Chicago. Jill, while we're talking about eating here, we would transition to what we're eating, but we haven't heard yet what you're reading this weekend.
I'm happy to go straight to eating, by the way.
Well, how about you give us both, reading and eating? Yeah.
Okay, what I am reading, I actually read a great column in Bloomberg by Sarah Green Carmichael. It was published last weekend called Working Moms Have a Secret. We Love Our Jobs.
Take that, Harrison Butker.
Seriously. So here is a bit of what she wrote. Judging by falling birth rates and declining intentions to have children, a growing share of educated women are evidently deciding that working motherhood is so unappealing that they're going to just opt out of having kids. She says, as a working mom myself, I'm not going to say it's always a rose garden, but this Mother's Day, let's take a closer look at the inner life of working mothers. Men are allowed to be proud of providing for their families. Why not us? And she goes through a lot of the research, which shows that full-time working moms suffer less depression and have a lot of other benefits compared to other moms, some who stay at home. And this isn't to pit working moms against non-working moms or those who work part-time. It's just to say, I actually just appreciated this column as a working mom myself, who, like a lot of other moms out there, I think just constantly feel incredibly guilty. And she was saying what I feel too, which is sometimes like a pride about working. And I think it's cool that my daughter gets to see me work and talk about it and thinks I have a cool job. And not only that, she talks about the pride of being able to contribute to your family in terms of income.
And we should note that that's actually a theme of the latest Mo News interview podcast. If you haven't heard our interview podcast, we have a conversation this week with Neha Harouche of Mother Untitled, all about stay-at-home moms, moms who've downshifted, moms who are taking a break, and all the various iterations out there and the latest research on that. She's also, in particular, over on the Mother Untitled Instagram account, had a lot to say about the Butker situation and some of the rhetoric around that. So take a listen this weekend if you have time and you're interested in this subject over at the Mo News interview podcast. It's the latest conversation. All right, Jill, the exciting conclusion. You teased it. What are you eating this weekend?
Okay, so my good friend Dana Pollock of Dana's Bakery, she was actually on this podcast, Moshe, when you were on paternity leave. She went to the Sweets and Snacks Expo in Indianapolis this week. It's a trade show for snacks and candy, basically looking at what's new and upcoming in the snack world. These are some of her takeaways. She says puff snacks are blowing up. So Pringles, for example, is coming out with puffer chips. She said they look kind of like twist ties. Some other trends, she said pickle, flavor, everything. So Are you a pickle person?
It depends. I like actual pickles. I don't know how I feel about pickle flavored things. We're gonna have to try some of that out. But it sounds like you're excited.
No.
I heard you wrong.
I'm just selling it. Okay. I'm just selling it. She also said there's a lot of freeze-dried candy, and she said everything's being made sour. So one thing to look for this Halloween, for example, sour Tootsie Rolls. Another thing she took note of, reversible gumballs. So candy on the inside, gum on the outside.
Interesting.
Sounds great for your teeth. So I should mention, if you're interested in learning more, if you're a candy person or a sweets person, you could check out her Instagram because she was doing great, fun coverage for the past couple of days. She told me everything is saved in one of her highlights. So it's at It's Dana Pollock, ITSDANAPOLLACK. And we are supposed to have dinner next weekend. So Dana, if you are listening, save me one of those Inside Out gumballs. All right, Moshe, what are you eating this weekend?
Jill, our friends at Adirondack Creamery, maker of one of our favorite ice creams, have 2 new flavors out, and we've gotten to try them. And I'm a fan of both, actually. Dark chocolate brownie is a new flavor, as well as Kashmiri Kawa, which has cardamom in it. Fascinating flavor. An interesting and tasty flavor. I'm a big fan of their Syrian date walnut ice cream as well. So we'll link to that. That should be available where you live. Again, it's the Adirondack Creamery. We ended with dessert, Jill. Both of us.
Nothing wrong with that. All right, everyone. We want to thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
Yes, and a reminder that we continue weekend coverage all weekend long over on the Mo News premium Instagram account. Right now, we have a 2-week free trial, so definitely check it out over at mo.news/premium. And give it a shot. It gives you extra content, but most importantly, it supports what we're doing here at Mo News with the daily podcast and all our other platforms.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Later.